You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 123. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, my friend. Welcome back to the podcast. It's Paula here, and I'm delighted to have you join me here this week. Thank you for joining. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. You have picked a wonderful episode to start out with, which of course is all about how to be your own best advocate. Now, for women lawyers in particular, I think this is such a great topic for multiple reasons. One of those reasons is that it's something that I see come up so often in my practice. I have lawyers that I work with who are incredible advocates when it comes to everybody else. And yet when it comes to advocating for themselves, they really struggle, whether it's setting boundaries, whether it's charging the full rate for their services, whatever their challenges happen to be, they're really having a hard time advocating for themselves. And I also find that it's one of those situations that ties nicely with that classic expression about the cobbler having no shoes. If you have not heard that expression before, it's one of those ancient sayings. I think it goes back to the time when people lived in villages and you had a village cobbler, the person who would make shoes for everybody else. And the idea with that expression, the cobbler has no shoes or has very shabby shoes, basically expresses the idea that they are so busy taking care of everybody else's needs that they either don't take care of their needs at all, or they do it in kind of a haphazard way such that they're not really caring for themselves the way that they care for others. And so today's episode is all about how you can use the skills that you already have. You are a trained advocate, a professionally trained advocate. And if you find that this is a topic that resonates with you, whether you have no self-advocacy at all, or you do and you're looking to improve it, or you're already pretty good at it and you're looking for some ways to refine it, this podcast episode will help you. And what we're going to do today is dive into, first of all, how this shows up. So you might find that you relate to some of the examples that I share. Then I'm going to take you through a series of questions, and these questions are designed to help you, specifically you. And if you can, if you're in a situation where you can pause the recording and write down answers to these questions, I highly encourage you to do that because you will get so much out of this episode. You will get to know yourself so much better, and you'll develop ways in which you can step into that advocacy role for yourself. So with that, we're going to dive into the substance of today's episode. And to set up the issue that we're dealing with today, really the issue here is you as an advocate are so good at looking out for everybody else's needs, whether it's your client, whether it's a family member. If you're a mom, it's looking out for your kids. It may be friends, other people in your life. You may even be advocating for people you don't know very well. And yet you may find that when it comes to yourself, you hold yourself back. You're not advocating for yourself in the way that you're capable of. You are, in effect, the cobbler who's not wearing any shoes. Now, if you can relate to this, you are absolutely not alone. And there are a number of reasons why this may be happening. And so much of it goes back to social conditioning and some of the beliefs that we hold, whether they're conscious beliefs or unconscious beliefs. So examples that I came up with that may be holding you back from advocating more fully for yourself are, number one, you may find that you feel the need to put other people's needs first. You may feel like that is the right thing to do. So an example that comes to mind is you might be working on a project at work. There may be a whole team and a big project with lots of tight deadlines. And as you go through the task list and start allocating the tasks, you may realize that one member of the team is going to have to stay very late at the office. And as much as you'd like to delegate that role to somebody else, maybe a junior lawyer, you don't feel like you can do that. You don't feel like it would be right. And so you basically put other people's needs ahead of your own, and you take on that task that's going to keep you at the office late at night. So that's one example, but you can probably think of a lot of examples where there's that choice of putting yourself first or putting yourself last. And you may find that you often put yourself behind others. You put other people's needs ahead of your own. Now, it may also be that you don't want to come across as entitled. Now, the word entitled itself carries somewhat of a stigma, and you may not want to associate yourself with that stigma. So instead of asking for what you need, instead of asking for a raise, instead of asking for a promotion or something that would add to your experience of your work, and this also applies outside of work, you may hold back, you may not ask because you don't want other people to think of you as entitled. You may also want people to think that you're hardworking. You may not want them to think that you are lazy or not a team player or trying to avoid taking on responsibility. And as a result, you might take anything and everything that comes your way, every task. You may never say no. You may even put your physical health to the side so that you can get more done. You may also find that you're motivated by a desire to have other people like you. Now, this can impact your self-advocacy because you might find that you're minimizing your achievements. Instead of sharing them, if somebody gives you good feedback, you might play it down. You might downplay your role on a project. If somebody compliments you, you might reject that compliment. You may have said this yourself, oh, it was nothing, or it was a team effort, or say something in the moment that almost diminishes the recognition that somebody else is trying to give you. It may also be motivated by guilt. You might feel guilty because you see other people struggling and you yourself are not struggling. And so you feel guilty to ask for more, even though you may need it and even though you deserve it. So what can happen here is instead of advocating for yourself, what you may find is that you actually become your own worst critic. And you may find that you set up unrealistic expectations for yourself. And you may find that you work without rest. And then when you finally do rest, you feel guilty about it. And you may also find that you neglect your own self-care. Now, you might find as well that you set standards for yourself that are unrealistic. These may be standards and expectations that you would never impose on anybody else. And yet that's what you expect of yourself. Now, we know that you are a high achiever, that you're intelligent, that you have managed to accomplish a lot already professionally and outside of work. And so you are getting results, and you may be where you are today because you have found strategies that help you excel. And these attributes, this idea of putting other people's needs first, attributes of not wanting to come across as entitled, wanting to be hardworking, all of this may have allowed you to achieve what you have achieved so far. But if you find that you have set the standards so high to prove yourself, that you have set your expectations out of reach, and that you will not advocate for yourself until you have reached those standards, you may find that you never climb out of that cycle. So what I'd invite you to ask yourself when it comes to advocating for yourself, the question is this: at what point will you feel ready to advocate for yourself? Put another way, what measurable checklist items, so if you think about what tasks, if you were to make a list, what checklist items do you need to satisfy in order to justify asking for what you want and for what you need? Now, if you are in the habit of not advocating for yourself as a matter of course, you may find that you let things go and say it doesn't matter. So for example, a client might say something to you that is disrespectful and you shrug it off, you let it go. You might find that you're working on a project along with a team and you're always the last person in the office and you choose to let it go. You may describe yourself as having a long fuse, but when you push your mind and body, what you might find is that eventually your mind and body will push back. So you might feel fatigue, you may feel resentment, you may feel a lack of recognition and appreciation, you may feel a lack of enjoyment, a lack of motivation, and in some cases, even burnout. And you might hope or expect that other people around you will step in as your advocates. You may hope that they will sense what's going on, they will see how hard you're working, and they will step in to help you out and advocate on your behalf. However, this is not a reliable method because often, first of all, they may see you doing all the things and being so efficient and so effective, they may ask themselves, I don't know how she does it, but they may not question that this is something that you are not willingly and wanting to take on for yourself. The other problem here is that for it to become visible to others that you're in over your head, you may need to reach a certain point, whether it's a boiling point or some sort of a breaking point that you do not want to reach. If you could avoid it, you do not want to reach it. When you do not advocate for yourself, you may be holding yourself back. Again, you might be holding yourself in that stalemate pattern where you think to yourself, okay, when I do X, then I will step in as my own advocate. Then I will be in a position where I can do this. But if you keep that standard away from you, if you keep those expectations ones that you will never reach, then you find you will never be in that position where you will feel like you can ask for what you need. So we're going to jump into solutions. I mentioned at the beginning, the solutions that I'm going to offer you are a series of questions that will allow you to get to know yourself better, that will help you figure out where it is that you could be stepping in as more of an advocate for yourself. This is not a formula or a step-by-step. If I thought that would be helpful to you, that is what I would offer to you. But here, I think the most impactful work that you can do is to get to know yourself and to uncover the relationship that you have with yourself and uncover the relationship that you have with your own self-advocacy. So as we go through these questions, if you can, I would encourage you to pause the recording and write down the answers, because I think that is how you're going to get the absolute most out of today's podcast episode. Now, if you can't do that, I completely understand. Even listening to these questions and answering them mentally as we go along is going to provide you with so many insights about yourself. So with that, we'll hop into question number 1. And that is, in what ways are you not advocating for yourself? This is a question that you can look at in the different realms of your life, whether it's your professional life or your non-professional life. Chances are there are situations that you find yourself in quite frequently, whether that is staying late at the office while everybody else has gone home, whether it's tolerating a certain behavior from a person at work or at home. It may be a colleague, it may be a client, it may be at home. It might be the person that you've entrusted to look after your kids. You might feel like they are running the show and not the other way around. You may be involved on a thankless project, or you might find that you're often involved on thankless projects that aren't necessarily aligned with your career goals, but people know that you're efficient, they know you'll get it done, and so they ask you to help and you say yes to it. So I'd invite you to think about what examples come to mind for you. They are going to be different depending on who you are and what your specific situation is. And so make a note of what those are. When you have made a list, I would invite you to ask yourself 2 more questions about these particular areas. Number 1 is, what is it costing you? When you do not advocate for yourself, what does it cost you? It might be the time that you spent committed to projects that aren't really aligned with what you want. It might be the energy, the mental focus that you're losing when you're interacting with people who aren't treating you with the respect that you deserve. It may be the discomfort that you experience. Maybe it's going back to the person who is responsible for childcare. If you're not able to ask that person for what you need, it may cost you in terms of your comfort with them looking after your kids. It might be the tasks that you then take on yourself because you're concerned about asking them. So look at what it's costing you to not be advocating for yourself. Again, it's going to be different depending on the examples that you come up with. And then the next question for you is, what would be different for you if you did advocate for yourself? So if you were able to have those conversations with your caregiver, for example, where they did take on the roles that you wanted them to take on, if you took that project that you've been involved in and put it in the hands of somebody else, what would that free up for you? What would that look like? So that was question number 1, is to identify the ways in which you are not currently advocating for yourself. The second question I invite you to consider is, what do you currently believe about yourself that prevents you from advocating for yourself? This is a deep question. I'm going to repeat it. What do you currently believe about yourself that prevents you from advocating for yourself? Now, if you are not currently advocating for yourself, standing up for yourself, asking for what you need, it may be that there are a lot of stories that you're telling yourself, whether they're conscious stories or unconscious stories that are holding you back. Some examples of what those stories might sound like is you may feel like you don't deserve to stand up for yourself. You may have been brought up in a family where your voice was not heard or recognized. You may have work experience where you're expected to simply do your job and not speak up. You may have been told implicitly or explicitly that your needs are not that important. You may have told yourself, I'm tough, I can take it. You may be in situations where something happens, you don't like it, whether it's the way that somebody talks to you, whether it's working late on a project, and you might tell yourself, it's only this once, I'll make an exception, but then you find yourself making that exception more often than you'd like. You might tell yourself you don't really need it, you don't want to make a fuss, you don't want to upset anybody. Somebody might say something to you that is rude or disrespectful, and you may tell yourself that you're sure that they didn't mean it that way. You may be concerned that if you speak up and ask for what you need, that you might ruin a particular relationship. So these are all ways in which you may be talking yourself out of self-advocacy, of standing up for yourself, of asking for what you want. And on some level, they carry a common theme of it's not worth it to make a scene. And the concern I have here is that you may be inadvertently telling yourself that you're not worth it to make a scene. So the second question, I'll repeat it one last time. What do you currently believe about yourself that prevents you from advocating for yourself? It is a deep question. And if you find that you are not advocating for yourself and the answers that come up are of this nature, you now have more information with which you can move forward. Now, it may simply be that you haven't given it any thought. The idea of self-advocacy hasn't really occurred to you. And now that you're thinking about it, it's something that will not pose a challenge for you. But you might also find that you want to be advocating for yourself, but you feel like, can you really do that? Are your needs really that important? Can you assert yourself, or is there something holding you back? The third question is, what will you need to start doing that you're not doing now? If you find that you're not advocating for yourself, then in order to start advocating for yourself, you will need to do things differently. So go back to that first question and identify some of the areas where you find you are not advocating on your own behalf. And ask yourself in relation to each of them, what would you need to do specifically? Are there conversations that you need to have? Are there projects that you need to hand back? Are there people in your life who are there to support you that you may have to let go and perhaps retain new people to help you? When you create your list, I'd invite you to think about which items on that list, which items are the easiest to do. And you might also think about what are some of the items that would be the hardest to do. What feels impossible to you right now? And as you go through the exercise, as you go through the process of self-advocacy and developing that as a skill, I'd invite you to consider starting with the easy wins and working your way up, because what seems impossible to you today may become your norm in the future. Now, the fourth question, and I'll just quickly recap the first three. Number 1, in what ways are you not advocating for yourself? Number 2, what do you currently believe about yourself that prevents you from advocating for yourself? Number 3, what will you need to start doing that you're not doing now? And number 4, what will you need to let go? Just like you're going to have to add into your strategies, add to the things that you're not currently doing, you're also going to have to let things go. Now, let's go back to some of the stories that you might be telling yourself. Things like your needs don't matter. You want people to like you. You want to show that you're a team player, a hard worker. You don't want to come across as being entitled. If you have a number of stories that you've attached to, whether consciously or subconsciously, and those stories are currently running the show, you may need to let go of some of those stories. So you'll need to ask yourself, what will you need to stop doing? If your instinct is to volunteer for everything and always say yes, you may need to stop saying yes all of the time. If your instinct is to please everybody, you may need to stop pleasing everybody. A related question, and one that goes a little bit deeper, is who will you need to stop being? If you are used to being the who, the person that everybody can turn to when they are in a pinch, and you change your role, that may require an identity shift. That can be a big transition for you personally, because that is going to ultimately change your self-concept. That is a deep question. And finally, what type of discomfort are you willing to experience as you let things go? So it may be that you're going to need to experience the feeling of disappointing other people. You may need to experience the feeling of being judged or perhaps not fitting in. So that brings us to the last question that I have for you, which is question number 5. And it's all about discovering your most powerful inner advocate. Here, what I would invite you to imagine is to think about somebody who you love fiercely. Somebody who you would step in as an advocate in a no holds barred kind of way. You would be at your utmost. If you looked at yourself on a scale of 1 to 100, you'd be at 100 when going to bat for this person. Now, this person might be a client who you have at work. It may also be somebody in your personal life. It might be a family member. It might be a friend. I know for myself, if I think of who on this planet I would go to town for, who I would be my most fiercest advocate for, it is hands down my children. I've done it in the past. I have discovered things about myself I didn't even realize when I was a lawyer even. So think of who that person is for you. Now imagine that that person needs you, that they are depending on you as their advocate. What steps are you going to take as their advocate? And I've got a list that I've prepared, and I'd invite you to create your own list because it will be different from my list, but I want to give you some ideas. So here they are. Number 1 is focus. When you are an advocate, the first thing that I do is to focus my time, my energy, my resources on figuring out what the problem is. What is the scope of the problem and what needs to happen here? Then you might find the right people, the people who are going to help you and the people that you may need to complain to. I would then invite you to think about the kind of pitch that you're going to make. Maybe you start out with a nice soft pitch. If that doesn't get the response that you're looking for, you need to turn up the volume. You need to make a stronger pitch. You would very likely advocate without fear of judgment or failure. My guess is that you would pursue your goal relentlessly without giving up. This would not be a negotiable idea for you. This is something you've committed to 100% no matter what. And you're committed to the outcome. Now, things that you would not do. Imagine that person that you care about most in the world is depending on you. What are you not doing? Well, chances are you are not blaming that person for the problem. You're not wasting time blaming them. You are not giving up because you don't feel like doing the work. You're not dismissing their needs as unimportant, and you are certainly not dismissing that person as unimportant. And you're not holding yourself back because you don't want to come across as too assertive, too committed, too passionate, or of course, too entitled. Now, I invite you to think about what would happen. Imagine if you took those very same attributes, those very same steps, and applied them to yourself. So go back to number 1. Think about an example where you're not fully advocating for yourself. And imagine that you're going to go to bat for yourself in that particular area. Think about what that would mean for you. Imagine, again, you can use your own list, but using this list because it's here, we can use it for the purpose of this exercise. Imagine that you go after your goal. This is something that you need, something that you want. And so you give it your focus. You figure out the scope of the problem. You identify exactly what needs to happen. You find the right people who are going to help you, and you find the right people to complain to. You make your soft pitch. If that doesn't work, you make your stronger pitch. You advocate for yourself without fear of judgment and without fear of failure. You pursue your goal relentlessly and you commit to the outcome no matter what. This is not negotiable. What do you not do? You do not blame yourself for the problem. You do not give up because you don't feel like it. You do not dismiss your needs as unimportant, and you do not dismiss yourself as unimportant, and you do not hold yourself back because you don't want to come across as too assertive, too committed, too passionate, or too entitled. So this sums up the exercise. The exercise is those 5 questions. Number 1, in what ways are you not advocating for yourself? Number 2, what do you currently believe about yourself that prevents you from advocating for yourself? Number 3, what will you need to start doing that you're not doing right now? Number 4, what will you need to let go, including who will you need to stop being? And number 5, how can you harness your most powerful advocate and be that advocate for yourself? Now, you may not even have realized before listening to this podcast that you weren't advocating for yourself. This may be the first time you're even thinking about it. And if that's the case, now that you have seen it, it would be very hard to unsee it. You have the advocacy skills that you need already. They have gotten you to where you are now. They have gotten your clients to where they are now. And now it's time for you to use those very same skills for yourself. What you need on top of those skills is nothing more than willingness. Willingness to feel the discomfort of asking for what you want without apologizing. The willingness to tolerate the discomfort of going against your instinct of acting like your needs do not matter. It's a willingness to accept that people may not like it and they may not like you when you advocate for yourself. And finally, it's the willingness to experience the feeling that may be very awkward, especially at first, of getting what you asked for and accepting it, allowing it, and then creating more of it. This is an exercise and a practice that I invite you to develop one step at a time. Over time, what you'll find is that your skills as an advocate for yourself will continue to develop until that becomes your instinct. And what you'll notice is some point along the road, you'll find there's a shift where you no longer think twice about advocating for yourself. Not only will this shift what you experience at work, what you experience outside of work, but you will also be showing others and leading by example that they too can become advocates for themselves. So we're wrapping up today's podcast episode. As we move forward and as you move forward, I invite you to look for those opportunities for you to step out as your own best advocate. Start small, little steps, and build your way up. I hope you have enjoyed today's podcast episode as much as I have enjoyed sharing it with you. I would absolutely love to hear from you. If you have any questions, please do feel free to reach out to me. If you enjoy listening to this podcast, I do highly encourage you and invite you to like it, review it, wherever it is that you download this podcast. It will help others just like you find this podcast and ultimately build the community of like-minded professionals who are all seeking to create work, a life, a practice that we can truly enjoy. Thank you again for joining me here this week. It's been such a pleasure. I look forward to reconnecting with you again next week. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.